I'm not doing screen sharing. We're going to go over the documentation for the buyer consult, but this is meant to be a little bit more interactive, conversational. So I'm just going to give it another minute or two to see if anybody else shows up here. Karen is here, so I appreciate that. All right. Actually, there is one document. I won't be able to share it with you guys, but I can just kind of give you a general idea of where it's from. This is taken straight from realtor.com, and it's a general asking the right questions for a buyer consult, sit down with a buyer. It's 25 questions, and honestly, I just recommend that everybody take it and make their own, style it however you want it, brand it however you want, but these are kind of a good basis for the questions that you want to go into a buyer consult with. You got a copy of that? Okay. Okay. So first thing I want to do is kind of go through some of the documentation that we bring to, in theory, the buyer consult. Now, my first question to you or anybody on the screen is, when would you say the right time is to actually sit down and do this buyer consult, as we call it?
I would like to go first. Normally, when I do a buyer consultation, it would be, well, lately is either after the first showing or right before. And if the showing goes well, then definitely right before we submit an offer. But typically, it's after the first showing.
Yep. Anyone else?
I like to do my consultations before I even go on a first showing, if at all possible, and preferably after they've gotten pre-approved. But if not possible, then prior to a pre-approval and before a showing even begins.
Yeah, in theory, that's definitely ideal. And we're going to talk in general terms today because, of course, everything is situational and sometimes the needs change for the clients. I will always try to do it before any showings take place, because I find that the buyer consult is really the very best time to actually set the expectation with the client of what they should be prepared for, from everything to the actual showing to the process of the transaction. And I love what you said about after, in theory, they've been pre-approved. That's definitely the best order that we can hope for. What would you say, would anyone say would be the purpose, aside from what I just said about setting the buyer expectation? What are some other purposes of the buyer broker conversation? I will tell you what I think they are. David, set up agency. Yep, absolutely. Explaining the scope of the broker's duties and the buyer's obligations. Like to have that conversation right from the get, which is perfect because when we look at the very first document going into it, hang on a second. I'm sorry that I'm not screen sharing this with you guys, but the right to represent agreement spells out the broker's duties, our responsibility to the broker, our responsibility to the client, as well as the client's responsibility to us. So let me take a step back. When I am getting ready to sit down with clients, what I like to frame this as is it's a buyer broker, it explains agency, but I also like to call it a loyalty agreement. I feel like that sets the precedent that we're having a conversation that is going to end with you deciding, obviously, that I am the agent for you. So I feel that calling it a loyalty agreement from the beginning kind of lets them know that we do have an expectation, and I'll say this during the process, that they're going to pick us as their agent. And one of the questions that I like to ask and get out of the way, I know that some people definitely don't ask this question, but have they signed an agency agreement with another agent or another brokerage? And I actually kind of want to open that up to a little bit of conversation because we have new people and people who've been doing this for a long time. There's different schools of thought on that. I like to, like I said, I like to just keep everything above board and really not waste my time or the client's time. If they are shopping for agents, that's one thing, but if they signed an agreement and just don't particularly care for that agent or don't like the way they're treating them, they have to kind of go about ending that agreement before we can really continue on.
It should be, especially even legally, one of the first questions that you ask a client is, have you signed anything with another agent? Because if they have, then you are on the hook, and like, you don't get paid, and your client could get, sued for the commission afterwards. And it's just an overall really, not good situation. It should be one of the first questions that's asked when meeting with anybody new.
Agreed. So another purpose that I kind of referenced was setting the expectation for the prospective client. It's really setting not only the expectation, but setting the foundation for the entire relationship. I look at going into the buyer broker consultation as my end result is to come out of it with these prospective buyers trusting me. So that comes from obviously sharing my wisdom and advice. And as we know, we can't do that unless they have agreed that we are the only agent that they're working with. So I think it's important to tell them exactly why this is needed to be signed and why we can't if they have with someone else. So those are the two reasons that I would say are the purpose of the buyer broker. But at the end of the day, it's fact finding for us as well. We're trying to extrapolate as much information as we can from however willing the buyer might be, if that makes any sense, because sometimes people will come off as cold. Some people want to tell you their entire life story. At the end of the day, the more that we can find out, the better we can serve them. So I encourage people to be as open as possible. I also try to, before we even get into the paperwork, do just a brief explanation of this is a representation agreement. So although we're not an attorney, we are legally representing them in the purchase of their home. So, but going farther into the explanation, our representation of them means that their needs come before ours within this conversation, within this transaction. Some people like to say fiducially, it puts our buyer's needs in front of our own. It does, but it puts a lot of the buyer's needs in front of our own, not just the fiduciary responsibility. But to take it a step farther, if this is a relationship business, it's so that the client feels comfortable with absolutely everything that they're going through in the transaction. The worst thing I think that could happen is you get through it and they say, I really didn't understand what was going on. I want them to understand absolutely every step of the way. So coming into the exclusive right to represent agreement, as I stated, this defines the relationship with the broker and the client, and then our relationship with the broker. And what I love is I'll reference this and say, this is also in lieu of an adulting conversation. This spells out your requirements, what's expected of you as a buyer. So that usually segues me into the conversation about Virginia being a buyer beware state. And what that means is some states are a seller disclosure state. Buyer beware state means it's really on the buyer to do any and all fact finding, whether it comes to inspections, whether it comes to moisture and mold, whatever their concerns are. That's again specific to the property, but it all falls on the buyer, and the expense of all of that falls on the buyer as well. Let's just get that out of the way so that they know that they are expected to pony up. And then later on, I kind of go into what the expectation is they're going to pony up during the transaction. So we come through the exclusive right to represent. We finish. So I just realized this one looks different than the one I have. This is the newest. What I will focus on here, the second page, yeah, I have it looking a little different. I'll touch on the dual representation. It seems that a lot of the public thinks they know what that means, and I think it's important for us to explain exactly what that means, because a lot of the buyers, one of the first things out of their mouth is, what do you have for sale? Thinking that us as a listing agent are trying to sell our own properties. And while of course we are, with this firm being a no dual agency firm, which I agree with, it just keeps everybody safe. So I'll go into that and I'll tell them that if they do become interested in a listing that I have, I'll be very happy to turn them over to one of the agents that I trust in my office to take good care of them. And then we move into the definition of designated agency. So we'll spend some time talking about the two of those. Electronic signatures, I do like to bring that up kind of in the beginning, just so we have that expectation, because the entire conversation changes if they're not able to do electronic signatures. So we get that out of the way. I like the new sheet with all of their information. All right. So I'm going to skip over the unrepresented document here, unless, Lucy, you think that I should go into it. All right, so then we come to the CDIF and chapter 27. So I don't get overly detailed in this during the buyer consult. I will bring a copy of this with me and leave it with them and tell them to read it at their leisure before I send it over to them for signatures. But I want them to have a physical copy to go home and pan through. What I will do is highlight certain things. So one of the things I'll highlight is the fact that we can be prepared to be on video, potentially on audio. I will then segue into, where do we go here? Sorry. I'll go into the ACUs. I'll bring up anything and highlight anything on here that's going to lead to a further disclosure, because this is basically the disclosure saying these are the disclosures. As repetitive as it is, it's important. I will highlight Megan's Law disclosure, because I will have clients that'll actually want me to do that research and we have to point them in the right direction. Pretty much any of the responsibilities that fall on the buyer, if I can give them places to find the information, hopefully more than one place, because we want to make sure that the information that they're getting is accurate. But yeah, I'll hand this to them and just have them read it and let me know if they have questions. One thing I do make clear is that although it's not a seller disclosure state, the sellers do need to disclose if they know that methamphetamines were made on the property. Other than that, I let them know that even though it's not a seller disclosure state, I'm more than happy to inquire from the listing agent and start building that relationship, what information the seller is willing to share. Not only what updates, but are they willing to say, you know, there might have been a problem here. A lot of times they won't disclose anything, but I'm not afraid to ask. So plow through that. And we have the same document. Bear with me. That leads us into chapter 7, similar conversation. This dispels their rights as a buyer in the state of Virginia and what they can do about it and how they can best protect themselves. Also does talk a little bit about how the seller is protected through the transaction. There's one other thing I'll go through on that. This is a good place to start the conversation about flood zones. It's just a small part of chapter 27, but I think it's important because we live in an area where over 50% of the properties are in some kind of a flood zone. So we'll have the conversation about what an elevation certificate is and how that can help them out if they're deep within a flood zone. And I'll also show them at this point what the flood zone map looks like and how we find that information. And how it's attached to every single listing. So I'll know before we go to every single property, whether or not it's in a flood zone, what type of flood zone. So we have that information specifically for when we talk to our homeowners. Insurance. Moving on, we have the escrow notice. This is a disclosure stating that we do have relationships, not just with Jones Walker and Lake, but this is an opportunity to see what it looks like when we have a relationship with another company. We'll always be forthcoming and disclose that. And I let them know that if they're not a first-time homeowner, they've used a different settlement company or attorney for closing, the choice is completely theirs. I just want the opportunity to do a little bit of research. But typically we have this conversation way before we're even putting in an offer so that I already know if they're using ours or going to use somebody else. The cybersecurity notice I take out of the package and I'll literally hand them separately and put it at the top of the pile. I feel like in this day and age, this is the most important thing, or one of the most important things that we can talk about. Sorry about that. Put that away. So I will actually use a story that another agent went through a couple years ago. I think I heard about this in 2020, but it happened in 2019. They had buyers, they had been warned to be careful about any communication they got asking them to wire money, even if it looks like it's from the lender, the settlement company, or myself, that before they click on anything or do anything that's requesting money, to give me a call so that we can take a look at it and I can call the appropriate people. It's a great selling point for Jones Walker and Lake. I absolutely love the fact that every single client has the ability to walk through the wire process with somebody from there on the phone. I think that that's fantastic. But coming back to my story of what happened, I think it was a night or two before closing, her clients received a request for the down payment and closing costs to the tune of $90,000. They did it. They sent the money. It was a fraud. It was, everything was exactly the same as the title company, with the exception of 1A. The font was different. And that was how they were defrauded, and the money was gone. The purchase didn't happen. A lot of a domino effect, but I'm not afraid to use stories like this to scare our clients a little bit into taking this seriously. Because this is one of the biggest things that obviously could blow up the transaction, and we don't want to see that happen. Say hi to Thomasina.
Hello, everybody.
Questions about the agency notice and the escrow agency notice and the cybersecurity notice. Does anybody have anything that they want to add to that? I guess not. Moving on. So the affiliated business disclosure, the ABA, as we call it, this is a further example of when we are upfront about relationships that we have. And I like the fact that this one does give the breakdown of the closing costs. So again, I'll put that in front of them. I don't need to hold their hand walking them through it, but pay attention to this because it's going to come up many times. Lead paint disclosure. I will email that to anyone who is sending me properties, obviously, that were built before 1978. It's very clear. Always cover yourself, always send it, and make sure that they've had a chance to read it. If somebody says to me, I don't want to read it, what's it about? Basically, don't lick the walls. Don't let your kids lick the walls. Don't let your pets lick the walls. Kind of in jest, but not really. I think that kind of sums up.
Don't scrape your nails.
Don't scrape your nails and then put them in your, I don't know who does that, but.
Kids.
Let me just chime in for a minute here and say that regardless of what they plan on looking for, we require as an office that this be initialed by the buyer, because you never know in the midst of showings when things shift on a dime and the buyer suddenly is buying something built in 1948 rather than 2020.
Yep. That brings up a question that I have for you, Lucy. If it's a, and I think I know the answer, but I want to hear it from you to be sure. If a house has been 95% remodeled.
Nope, you still need it.
Okay. That's what I wanted to know. Just again, for everybody to cover themselves. Yep. I like the fact that I did not know that we have to have the buyers initial it. That makes it a lot easier.
Yes,
so
buyers
I
must
even have a
initial
property
regardless.
I even have properties that in Norfolk, it was okay for a long time for properties to basically be taken down to the foundation and then rebuilt back up using like a certain amount of the original structure. But you still have to put the year that it was built, which is usually the 1950s. And that still requires a lead-based paint disclosure, even if all the drywall is brand new.
That's what I'm going with. So that gets through the bulk of the buyer consult paperwork. Now, everybody has a different style. I definitely am more of like the touchy-feely kind of, let's get to know each other, let's sit down. So if I have the opportunity, if it's possible, after they've been pre-approved and before we go out looking, to have a separate hour to 2 hours with the clients. Again, that's where I feel like it really instills trust. We can give them paperwork all day, but to sit down and really want to hear about exactly what they're looking for. So I'll sit down with them, bring the paperwork, and then I usually bring either the laptop and the iPad as well. And I want to spend some time with them actually on HomeSnap, because we can send people the invitation all day long. I have a lot of people who either have problems with technology, or they feel like I've had some people who absolutely refused to download it upon being sent from me because they were worried about their information getting out there. But they're much more comfortable with it if we can sit down and use it together. And I'll even show them my view, because we can see the confidential information that they can't. So I want them to know that I have access to more information than they do, to encourage them to send me properties ahead of time. It tells me a few things. It tells me what they're jazzed about, what they're looking for in a home. It's not always something that people readily have at the end of their tongue until they start looking. So go ahead and send me things just because this is a style that you're interested in. And I find that what they are looking for, their needs, their goals, have a tendency to change. So I really want to, again, in front of them, encourage them to use that text feature. It's the biggest selling point, I feel, to the clients, because a lot of the other, and I tell them, there's Zillow, there's Realtor, there's Homes.com. Their information's not always current, or has to be within, I say, usually a 6 to 12 hour period, allowing for a little bit of, agent being human and not getting paperwork done on time. But for the most part, HomeSnap is the most accurate, and you have constant access to me directly. It allows me to focus on you. And I'll even go in and show them some previous conversations that I've had on HomeSnap, because it shows where we're talking and where they've sent me listings, and then I can get back to them with more pertinent information. So I'll spend as long as I feel like it takes to get them really comfortable using HomeSnap with me. I would say 75% of the time when I do that, and I'm careful about when I have that buyer consult, because I want to give them an hour to 2 hours. If I can, I'll leave a little bit of time open after that, because sometimes sitting down with HomeSnap and the client gets them so excited that there's 1 or 2 properties they might want to see that day. And I'm here for that. I love that. Again, it's a matter of timing, but once they feel like they're on board with how to use the same technology that we are, it gets them excited. It gets them motivated. Again, the hope is that they are already pre-approved. So after I sit there and we play with HomeSnap for a while, there are all kinds of, on Canva, you can find various maps of the transaction. And one of the reasons that I like to have this conversation at this point is because I feel like, especially with first-time home buyers, that they want to know a lot, but they want to know what is going to be expected of them financially before the closing. So we'll have a conversation about the down payment. We'll have a conversation about the EMD. Well, actually, that's part of this. We'll have a conversation about the closing costs, and we'll have a conversation about the down payment. That's what they're responsible for on the day of. But it's important to know how much they're going to have to shell out, how much they should have in their bank account separate from that going into it. So I have various maps. I have one in a little trifold brochure that I always bring with me to kind of look through. And I'm sorry that I don't have it now, but I can share it by email. And we start off with, we run around and we're looking for properties, and we find the one that you love, right? And we're going to write on it. I'm going to run home. I'm going to write it up. I'm going to send it over for signatures, but I'm also going to call you so we can talk about that paperwork as you're looking at it. Or I'll just let them know that they can call me if they have questions. And also, actually, during this buyer consult, I will open up the purchase agreement, and I'll review that and how it correlates to what they're signing off with the disclosures here, to have them prepared for the 15 pages of information that they're going to get and sign off on. So we'll write the offer and say the offer immediately gets accepted. Okay. We go through the terminology of under contract, ratified, and how they all correlate to essentially mean the same thing. Obviously, we use real estate terms, and I try not to do that with my clients. In this situation, I'll let them know what the real estate terms are so that they're not confused when they hear me. If they're thinking under contract and they hear me say ratified, I want them to feel comfortable with the terminology. So I let them know that if our offer has been accepted, my spiel is that they have 48 hours to make that EMD payment. I believe it's a little bit longer now. Is that right? It's 5 days.
They have to have it to the earnest money holder, the escrow agent, within 2 days of ratification. The escrow agent has 5 business days to get it deposited.
Okay. Well, it seems that with Jones, Walker, and Lake, I get a receipt within a half an hour that it's been deposited or cleared. So I'm going to stick with my 48 hours. Again, I do have a tendency to instill a little bit of fear on the timeline. Just to, again, setting that expectation. So we'll discuss what they're going to be comfortable with on what property and how much of an EMD to offer. And once we're ratified, I let them know that they're if we're using Jones Walker Lake, they're going to hear from them themselves by email, giving them 3 different options of how they can make that payment. And again, reiterate that it cannot be a credit card payment. This is very important. And the explanation is simple. A credit card is considered financing, and you can't finance an earnest money deposit. That's pretty much my verbiage on that. And then I let them know that on average, depending on how we write up the offer, we're going to have about 7 days in which to schedule, get the home inspection done, discuss the home inspection, as well as put together our request for repairs. And I really try to get that done actually within 3 days. It's just a personal goal. I want to give everybody on both sides the opportunity to do what they need to do. And the truth of it is, I find that if you really wait the 7 days, we're not giving the listing side as much opportunity as possible to get estimates done. Because if we're going to ask for repairs, then they need to get busy on their end, finding out how much, and sometimes they want to do that before they agree. So just for example, I ratified on this Monday night, Tuesday morning, and there was an opportunity to have the home inspection on Wednesday, done. As of Thursday afternoon, spoke to my clients, decided what we wanted to ask for, and by last night had the PICRA in the hands of the listing agent who appreciated it. We had a big ask, and they're going to need to get a couple of estimates. So that is the goal, and I'll tell my clients we want to get that done as soon as possible. We really don't want to wait the full 7 days. Any questions about how I explain that to my clients? No. Okay. I go into the definition of a contingency and how that affects the timeline. So that's part of the conversation as far as the home inspection. Contingency, basically, as far as the consumer is concerned, is the contingency is a time period in which I can get you out of the transaction and get your EMD back. I want to make it very clear that when we are outside of the contingency and they want to back out, they're probably not going to get their EMD back. I'm magical, but I'm not that magical. Still pretty magical. So when the contingency period is starting and ending, I'm going to let the clients know that I'm going to be on top of them for that. And one way to avoid any disruptions in the timeline is that when myself or the lender or the settlement company asks for anything to be signed, let's get it done within 12 hours. I know that that might seem extreme to some people, but I feel that that is enough time before, after work-related times that might not allow them to do it. Again, 24 hours is acceptable, but if I feel that if I set that timeline at 12 hours, we stay on track. And then we'll talk about if we have a condo docs or we're waiting for POA docs, that we have another contingency period that starts the moment basically it hits our email box. I don't wait for anything to go wrong with that because communication is really important when it comes to that one. It'll be sent to me, it'll be sent to my clients. If it's sent directly to me, I immediately send it to my clients and I let them know, okay, you have 3 days from now to let me know if there's anything in here that you've read that would make you think that you don't want to go through with this purchase. Or honestly, keep it in the back pocket if there's something else going on. It is another time period that I can get the EMD back and them out of the contract without being in breach of contract. We'll talk a little bit about the financing contingency, but more importantly, what I do with that is I let them know it's on every single lender letter. But we know that the lenders don't always hold them accountable in a timely fashion that we might be able to. Sometimes the lender relies on us, and that's fine with me. The initial letter that comes out with a request for documents to the lender, I let the clients know that they have 5 to 7 days to get that to the lender, period. No ifs, ands, or buts, and to be prepared for every week and a half to 2 weeks that we're under contract, they're going to ask for updated documents. I feel really strongly about that because it's when the buyer is not prepared for all of that, that they usually balk and say, this is too much paperwork. I'm feeling overwhelmed. I need help. It's part of the adulting conversation that what we expect from them. And I've really only had one situation where somebody was completely negligent about getting lender docs open. It was a nightmare, and I never want that to happen to me or anybody else. Okay, so those are, all right, so we were talking about moving through the timeline and what they're held responsible for payment. I let them know that the square footage of the house is actually what's going to determine how much the home inspection costs. Let's find out if they're a service member, because they do get a discount for that. And we'll talk about whether or not it's important to do additional inspections. So any house that is on a slab, raised slab or not, I'm going to recommend that we spend the extra $150 to $250 to bring in an additional plumber to actually scope the lines under the house. There are home inspection companies out there that say that they do it. I want to warn everybody, they will scope the line from the house to the city cutoff, but not necessarily through the pipes that are underneath the house. And the reason we want to do that is because if they are, we have a lot of cast iron pipes put in houses in the 70s and 80s, and we still have some Quest piping here that we have to deal with. So we want to be able to see if there's a problem below or not. The reason is because if there is a problem and it's not caught until after possession has happened, because it's on slab, the amount of work that goes into fixing the problem and then reflooring can be, you know, 15, 20,000 very, very easily, even just on a small townhouse. So we want to get in front of that as much as possible with the additional inspection. Also, if the chimney is important to them and it does not say in the listing chimney as is, because we will see that a lot. But if it doesn't say that and it's important that they have a working fireplace, we're going to do a full chimney inspection. We can potentially wait until we have already done the home inspection to see what the home inspector says if they see a problem, but I would actually just rather have a chimney sweep come to the home inspection. They take pictures in places that the home inspector cannot. And the home inspector, especially if it's gas, obviously, they'll try to get it to work. They might even get the starter to work, but sometimes there's a little trick to actually get the gas logs going. I want a home inspector is going to back off from actually going that far because they don't want to break anything. If we have a chimney sweep there, they can really kind of get their hands dirty and mess with it with the seller's permission. So I'll explain to them that we ask for the additional inspections. If you feel that the roof is really old, you can certainly bring in a roofer to certify the roof. I also, at this point, will strongly recommend that if we know it's an older roof, find out if it was warranted, if it's still under warranty. That's important as well, because if it's still under warranty and we find problems in the roof, they can get the original roofer back out there. So any questions about any of that so far? Just dealing with the inspections. Cool. At that point, so we've talked about the money they're going to have to shell out for the EMD. We've talked about the money that they're going to have to shell out for inspections. To include obviously moisture and termite if the buyer is buying that. And then we'll talk about the appraisal. When I first started, it seemed like appraisals were being paid for separately. Lenders were asking people and telling them they could put it on a credit card. It seems like now it's for the most part, and if anybody has a different experience, please tell me, seems like now at this point it's rolled into the closing costs. Does that seem like a fair statement that we're seeing these days?
I've seen it happen both ways. It just really depends on who the lender is and what program the buyer is going through. But personally, you know, I'm like a lot like you, Rebecca, where I would much rather play it safe than sorry, and I'd rather have them be prepared to pay that money out of pocket, and not have to, and have it be like a nice surprise, like, oh, cool, I don't have to do this,
Right.
rather than the opposite.
Absolutely. So to set them up for that, I kind of tell them the same thing, that for the most part it's paid through the closing costs, but this lender might reach out to you to ask for a credit card number or however you want to go ahead and pay for it. Appraisals right now, honestly, are kind of running between $500 and $800. I'm seeing them go up that high. For the most part, they're between $5 and $6, but again, I want to buffer it so I look like a little bit of a hero when it's not that much. So that's where the appraisal conversation is. Hang on one second. And then they should anticipate moving costs. I think that this is something that a lot of agents get a little bit nervous about talking to them about, but I know that for myself, and I tell this to my clients, I never want to put anybody in a house poor. So we want to make sure, and I'll say to people, I don't need to get into the details of your finances. That's the lender's job. And I say that repetitively from the beginning through the whole process. It doesn't stop clients from calling you and saying, I want to talk about my rate. That's not something that we can in any way affect positively or negatively. So that's a lender conversation. But you just kind of want to let them know that, you know, if this feels tight, you're going to be able to get that sense from the clients and pay attention to that. And perhaps I've said to people, you know, maybe we need to talk in another 3 to 6 months. Let's set up a goal. Let's talk about your how you're saving money and what you can do to get into a better position before it's time to go out, because it might be fine if they have the EMD and everything else that they need through the transaction. But if that puts them at zero after closing costs and everything else, that's not really comfortable. And I don't think it makes us look like we're good at our jobs, for lack of a better word. If we are truly representing our client's best interests, that's a well-rounded statement. So that's my general take on that. And then if I get the, you know, thumbs up from them, like, hey, let's go, we're comfortable with what we have saved, great. I will also follow back up with the lender. Again, not saying I need to know numbers, but is this a close call? Is this a home run? So that we have a better idea kind of as we go through the process. At this point, I'm going to let them know that I will email them all this documentation that I've actually handed with them to read at home in their own time. I in the middle of changing it, but as far as this list of questions, I actually have one that I'll email along separately, and I do it under the guise of, I'll send it before anything else for them to fill out. And I do it as a way to determine if they're comfortable and how I can help them with the electronic signatures. Because if they have an issue filling this out, we're going to have an issue with anything, but it's also just a neat way to get their information. We can sit here and go through all of their questions and everything that they're looking for at the buyer consult, but I want a more detailed version to come back to me. And that's the way that I typically do that. When we're having the conversation in person, it's a little bit more lighthearted and fun. How many bedrooms? How many bathrooms? Do you need a fence? Do you have pets? Is a garage important? Is a fireplace important? We need to have all of these conversations in a setting that they're comfortable with, but then the finer details. So that's usually how I finish it with the question. I've sent them the link to HomeSnap. If I can, I'll even have them download it literally in front of me if they haven't already, and then send them the rest of the documents to sign off on. And hopefully we are out and about looking at homes and they feel comfortable with the process. I'm definitely one of those people who ends every single conversation with, please let me know if you have any questions. I don't want anybody to ever get up from a table with me talking about real estate and they feel like they don't know what that conversation was about. And I think that we've all run into clients who have had that conversation with other realtors, or with the couple that I just met last week that I did the buyer consult with on Saturday. They were very upfront in telling me that they met with a realtor last year It was a family member's realtor who literally sent them the link to her website, and that was it, and said, let me know what houses you want to see. So I look at the buyer consult as a place to instill trust, instill loyalty, and so they know that they're in the hands of somebody who's going to take care of their needs throughout this transaction. So not everybody, please.
I was going to say, just to go off of that, I would 1,000% agree with you. And just, you know, we've got a couple people on here live, and for anybody who is listening to this later on, I have met with so many people, and I tell this success story to anybody I can. I've met with so many people, even people who are not pre-approved yet, and still go through the buyer consult just so they know what to expect when they are ready. And it's gotten me a lot of clients who come back to me. It's gotten me a lot of referrals. My most successful one was I met with people who I spent probably 2 hours with them, and their daughter, who I swear was like Honey Boo Boo's like twin, both in attitude and looks. But they sent me a referral that ended up being, these guys were only looking at like 150 plus. They could never get approved, like, but I still met with them and, you know, talked with them, and this is what the process would look like. They were so impressed with that they sent me their in-laws who are moving from California with a $400,000 budget, and they bought their house, and then called me a couple years later because they were ready to move again, and the house had appreciated, and it became over $1 million total in transactions because I spent 2 hours with Honey Boo Boo and her parents.
I love that. I love that. That's why we do it. That's why we do it. I've heard agents do this in 20 minutes because there are very successful, very transactional agents, but to instill that referral, that relationship over and over and over again, it takes putting in the time. It definitely takes putting in the time. I remember, I think it was Cindy actually was giving a class when I was here years ago about how one of her first clients, they literally brought a bag of change to the closing table. And I think Cindy even contributed a little part of her commission. And it was a tiny little purchase. But since then, between that client and their family, it produced, I think she said something like 38 following transactions, just from that small little nugget in the beginning of her career. And we have to focus on that, because if we lose focus on that, it's very easy for a couple of months to go by and be like, hey, nobody's calling. Where do I find my clients? But I feel like the longer that it's not even the longer, just the more effort that's put into, because a lot of times this buyer broker conversation is the first time that we actually meet with someone, unless it's someone in our sphere. They'll come to us through referral. They'll come to us either other agents, previous clients, but to give them the space to be in the spotlight and have this really whole thing driven to, this is for you. They're going to tell their family members about that. So I've had 2 people write reviews for me before we even got under contract. So I have to think that that was just because of the buyer consultation loyalty agreement. So that's what I got. I apologize if I was all over the place.
Can I just say that I love that you call it a loyalty agreement, and also that you factor in moving costs. I have never heard of anybody factoring in moving costs when they're going through the buyer's consultation. And that is so freaking smart, because moving is so expensive, and not just moving, but moving into a new house. Like, you're easily, every time you move into a new house, between the security system that you want to get, between all of the nooks and the crannies that you want to fill, or the thises and the that's, I mean, it is several $1,000s to get settled into a new house, and to have that expectation up front is brilliant.
Yep, I think it's very important. I didn't always do it. And I think what actually happened is that I had clients that were a little bit tighter than they had led me to believe. And it got a little bit sticky and uncomfortable for them, more so because they were embarrassed. And I had to go home from that conversation thinking, how much of that is on me for not setting up the proper expectation for them? And to be honest with you, this entire conversation is always a work in progress, because you fail forward, right? So when I realize that I've made a mistake or I've omitted something, that becomes the focus moving forward. Like I have to bring in the pieces that I might have missed before. So it's never like this is ever going to stay the same. And it's highly situational, again, based on kind of the, I'm an energy person, but the feeling that you get from the clients and their needs. So thanks, Jordan. Do you have any questions? No. Okay. Do you feel like I touched on the purpose of this conversation? And I like to talk about loyalty agreements in the buyer broker conversation. So if anybody ever wants to with me separately, I don't mind doing that. We can even like role play and pretend that you're the client or what have you. I just forgot what I was going to say. Anyway, the general gist is it's important to be able to give them the time to feel like they're the star of the show and this is all completely built around them. So on that note.
Rebecca, real quick before you leave, and feel free to say no, because I'm going to kind of put you on the spot here. But I love all the questions that you ask your clients throughout the process. Is there any way that you might be able to make up a list of like good questions to ask during the buyer's consultation and make it like a checklist type of thing for our new agents to be able to study?
Yeah, definitely. I have a couple different versions. I just need to merge them into one.
That would be phenomenal. And if that's something that you'd be willing to share, I think it's such a helpful tool.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Just make sure that, I's are dotted, T's are crossed.
Mm-hmm. Actually, there's one other thing that I bring up that I feel a lot of agents will probably bring up during the transaction, but I'll bring it up in the beginning again, because I think it shows or reinforces a level of trust. I let them know that I have a vendor list. I have at least 3 plumbers, at least 3 electricians, at least 3 HVAC. They've already gotten my list of 3 lenders. So they know that that's how I operate in threes. And I tell them through, in the beginning that this is something that I'm willing to share with them. I also let them know that I make modifications as some come and some go. And every time I tell them about that, they're literally like big eyes. That's very helpful. Did not realize that's something I'm going to need in my life as a homeowner. So it's just another little way that I feel like gets them to kind of see me in the light of, again, I'm taking care of all of their needs. So I'll include that in the checklist, and give me a couple of days, I can put something together.
That would be awesome. And you're not just, building this around them. They feel like you're taking care of their needs before they even know what their needs are, which is so crucial.
Yep. The other thing that I make sure to do either in the beginning or the end, when I say that I want to give them the opportunity to, please let me know if you have any questions. I also try to speak to, let me know if you have any questions about me. Okay. I'm an open book. Not everybody is like that, but I want from the beginning for them to understand I'm there for them, but I'm also a human being. So ask me anything that you want. You can ask me how long I've been in this business, et cetera, et cetera. I'll answer the questions as honestly as I can. For the most part, like I said, I'm pretty much an open book. I think that that's another way that they leave there feeling like she's not just doing her job, when she meaning me. She's not just doing her job. She gives us the impression that she cares about this process for us personally. So that was one other thing that I meant to add, but I'll put that all on the checklist.
Awesome. I'm super excited about getting that checklist.
I can probably have that for you by the beginning of next week.
You're amazing.
I try. That's it. Anyway,
you don't need to try hard, but
I am, if anybody else has any questions, great. If you want to reach out to me privately, what I meant to do, and I'm a little bit mad at myself, is when I had this buyer consultation on Saturday, I should have taped it. I have some old conversations from like lead calls that I would get when I taped myself. And if anybody ever wants to hear those, but I find that throughout the entire process of real estate from start to finish, the buyer consult is what I love the most. That whole get to know you thing. So if anybody ever does want to like sit down, do a little bit of role playing, I would be happy to do that. I am, if nobody else has anything, I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Everybody good? Have a great weekend.
Thanks. See ya.
Thanks, Rebecca.